So this is the key takeaway post, my episode titled Physical Activity Guidelines with Dr. Lori Witzel. And in that episode, we talked about what are the different components that we need to train, or the components of fitness, and then how often or how long do we need to train them. And then we talked about some other considerations along the way as well. So when it comes to adults, we need about 150 to 300 minutes of aerobic exercise in a week. That could be a combination of moderate and vigorous, and it's advised that it should be because I think variety is good for the body. However, it could be any blend of moderate to vigorous. So if you're doing a little bit more vigorous exercise, you could be closer to that 150-minute zone. And then if you're doing more moderate, you want to be a little closer to that 300-minute zone. But again, most people are doing a combination of the two, and that is also advised. In addition to that, we need 2 days a week of strength training. Dr. Lori Witzel also mentioned some other components of fitness that are important, such as balance for fall prevention and things in that nature. But we're going to talk about that in just a few. When it comes to kids, they need about 60 minutes of aerobic exercise in a day. And they also need 3 days a week of some form of strength training or bone building activity. When it comes to preschool-age children, she said about 3 hours of play in a day. And this will be something that they add a little bit more in with the next iteration that is coming out in 2028 of the physical activity guidelines. But just know that those younger children should be playing a lot and frequently throughout the day. So that gives you a little idea of the major components that you need to hit. But this is something that's going to be a little bit of my words here. And I say if you're just thinking about aerobic and strength training, I think you're kind of missing the mark a bit. I think about it almost similar to eating processed food, right? And we think about processed food, it's, you might just be thinking it's important to get calories, right? I need calories in order to live. There's these other little micronutrients or other nutrients or things that we can't even fully observe, right? I think some dietitians will say that there's reasons to eat whole foods that we might not even fully be aware of. There are other things in those whole foods that we couldn't even imagine. We try to break it down into the vitamins and minerals that we know, but there's these other micronutrients that are in there that are we're starting to discover and a little harder to observe and see. But there's other stuff in those whole foods, and it's very similar to physical activity. We need more than just to run on a treadmill, for example. We need to stimulate ourselves outdoors, whether that's playing a sport or game with friends, whether that's going on a hike. We need to engage our body in our environment, and that also means you're then going to hit on other components of fitness. Balance, agility, speed, coordination, all that's going to be in there. Then you're also going to be thinking about how you're stimulating the brain, because you're going to have to, you're going to be a bit more motivated. If somebody's running right next to me and I'm trying to keep up with them, the motivation to sprint a little harder will be there. The fact that I'm, distracting myself with strategies and tactics and different things, or if I'm walking in my environment, I might be looking at nature and other things and distracting myself a bit. But how are we also able to apply the aerobic and strength benefits in the real world? And that's where play comes in, and that's where some of these other components of fitness that we see are coming in. And in the physical activity guidelines, there is a big emphasis on balance. So it's not, it's kind of written in the paragraph underneath, but eventually I think we'll actually have some type of minute guideline for that as well. Like you need to do, 20 minutes of balance training a week, or whatever it is. So we understand the importance of balance for fall prevention, but I feel like we're gonna notice that all these other components of fitness, and being a well-rounded mover is going to be essential when it comes to physical activity guidelines. So we're starting to see movement in that direction a bit, and I think eventually in the future we'll see more and more about the health benefits of other components of fitness. So the next thing we'll touch on is what are some considerations that you want to think about when you're trying to meet the recommended guidelines. One thing we talked about in the episode is the importance of doing anything more than yesterday. So keep in mind, while I'm talking about this ideal of, even considering some of these other components of fitness, just know that anything you do that was more than yesterday is going to be beneficial. If you're not able to get 150 minutes yet of aerobic physical activity, that's okay. Meet yourself where you are. And eventually this is the goal that you're trying to get to. Another consideration we talked about is the fact that sometimes doing too much could be bad. We talked a little bit about like ultra marathon runners, and there is a U-shaped bell curve where movement is really good. Oh yeah, it's good. It's good for us. It's good for us. And then there's a point where it might start to tip off and where you go into a little bit of overtraining. You can build yourself up progressively and get to a point where you could do some pretty extreme stuff, but be careful that you don't fall into an overtraining bucket. An interesting one that she talked about was the occupational paradox, that people who they have a physically demanding job, you see these early mortality rates. We would think that someone who's more active throughout their day is going to have benefits with it, but we're noticing that, maybe there is a point, or in particular with work, for some reason, people who are really, have these physically demanding jobs, that there may be something to it there. But the point that I'm hitting at is there is a such thing as too much exercise, and we want to be careful that we're not overtraining. So another big thing that we're noticing is in previous iterations of the physical activity guidelines, you had to get at least 10 minutes or like a 10-minute block of activity in order to count it toward your 150 and 300 minutes. And we're noticing that you don't need to have this 10-minute block. It can be even less than 10 minutes. Marilee Apezzo from Stanford University is doing some pretty cool research on exercise snacking. And I like the word that she uses there, exercise snacking, right? So throughout your day, you should be taking these little breaks and little snacks of exercise. Myself, I have a pull-up bar like hanging right at my door. Sometimes I walk by, I do a couple pull-ups. I'm taking the steps. I ride my bike to the destination I have to go to. Any little bit of movement, the whole park far and walk type of thing, all of these things count. And exercise snacking throughout your day and bouts of exercises that are even less than 10 minutes are going to be beneficial for your health. So one of the other big things that stood out to me in the 2018 physical activity guidelines in comparison to the old ones that came out in 2008 that I knew so well, or even before that, but the impact of physical activity on the brain. We know that it's impacting things like anxiety, depression, sleep, cognitive performance, executive function falls under that umbrella, dementia, Alzheimer's. I feel like there was a point in my history, maybe, whether it was 10, 20 years ago, where we couldn't confidently say, everybody kind of knows, right? You have these intuitive feelings, but then you need, when research confirms it, I think it's even more powerful. I think intuitively, many people know that physical activity impacts the brain. But, maybe 10, 20 years ago, as far as research is concerned, it wasn't really fully confirmed, and it wasn't a clear statement that we can say. And, you had naysayers that would try to potentially even fight against that. Like, does physical activity really even impact cognitive performance or academic performance? And, do we really, really need it? Or how much is it really impacting? But I think we're at a point now where research has fully confirmed the fact that physical activity is impacting your brain. There's correlational studies. So, for example, movement and then things like test scores. But we're also seeing some very direct evidence and physiological evidence. For example, when we do a brain scan and we can see the amount of blood flow that goes to the brain when people are physically active. So we know that something's happening. We know that there's these actual very direct physiological connections. We're starting to discover more and more about growth factors and how bone and muscle can be even considered endocrine organs, which means that they communicate with other organs in the body. So for example, your muscle and your bone can secrete stuff into your bloodstream that will pass the blood-brain barrier and impact your brain. So some of those things are growth factors. One of the big ones we know a lot about is BDNF. But a newer one that's starting to rise is osteocalcin. So when you break down bone and rebuild it, osteocalcin is released into the bloodstream, and we're seeing that there's these connections to that also making its way to the brain and improving brain function or the neurons in the brain in some type of way. And I think there's still a lot to be discovered in this realm, and but we're starting to realize that there's way more to this picture. And I think in even 10 more years from now and 20 years from now, we're going to see that, like, not only is it undeniable, but it's like the connections between the brain and body are going to be so, understood to a whole nother level. A new, phrase that is starting to stick recently is, sitting is like the new cigarette. We're sitting so much, and it's becoming a problem in many areas of our life, more than just, the physical body or muscles and bones. It's impacting all the organs in your body, and it's definitely impacting your brain. So, quick little review. We all need to do aerobic exercise and strength training, but we're discovering that these other components of fitness are super important as well. Balance was a big one that's mentioned. Power is a big one as well. And I think we'll discover that all of these other components of fitness, of course, flexibility, body composition, the skill-related fitness stuff, agility, speed, all of these things are going to matter, and we're going to need to be a well-rounded mover. When getting your physical activity, it's important to consider things like play, variety, the blocks of exercise, or what I called was exercise snacking, the fact that we can get small little bouts throughout our day. We want to consider that we're not overtraining and doing too much, or especially too much too soon. You don't need to run a marathon tomorrow. You can take a recreational approach to this and just have some fun with it. And we also talked about the occupational paradox, in the sense of having a physically demanding job might not be as good as doing your exercise in your leisure time. Not to say that a physical labor job is bad, but I think there's a lot of research to do there. If you're doing physical labor on your leisure time, maybe landscaping your house or something like that, so physical work is not bad. It's more that probably an 8-hour shift of physical labor that is very demanding and pushing yourself through times where you knew you needed to take a break, but you're not allowed to, and you had to force yourself to do this unpleasant thing. That's probably very stressful on the body. So it's balancing this idea of, work and rest, of course, in a healthy way. And so those are some of the considerations we talked about in the episode. But I'll leave you with one last pretty cool thing. And she said they're working pretty hard on making physical activity a part of the healthcare system, a part of the prevention and treatment of individuals. In a sense, when you go into the doctor's office, the doctor might ask you how often or how much you exercising. In addition to whatever else we're treating, that's kind of part of the big picture and understanding that. And if you're not meeting these, for example, 150 minutes, I might be able to prescribe a personal trainer to you that can help to get you on board and get some of those minutes in. So this is something they're working pretty hard to do, and fingers crossed. That's pretty cool and a huge leap in the direction and understanding of how the importance of the body and how we're prioritizing it in all fields, not just our pastime. So I hope you got some gems from this here. I hope you understand a little more about the different components of fitness that you should be training and how often or how long you should be doing it. I hope you understand a little bit more about how to get it done and some of those considerations. Tune into the full-length episode because, again, there's a bunch of gems in there with Dr. Lori Witzel, and I hope to catch you all soon.